episode. Welcome you all to Climate Conversation, Climate Action Pathways, episode 16 with Quamrul Chowdhury. Today we are pleased to have a very rich panel. Bangladesh Prime Minister, Economic Advisor Dr. Mashiur Rahman is with us, and we have with us Halldor from Iceland, who has been a director of United Nations Framework Convention for many years. He was also a negotiator for many months. So we are also pleased to have you in this conversation. And we have scientist Professor Alan Miller, who has also been following climate change for very many years, since 1980s. So he has a famous book on it. And we have also with us climate negotiator from Bangladesh, Ziaul Haque from Department of Environment, who has been in the climate negotiation for quite long. So without much ado, I would now like to start this conversation. Today we are going to discuss the outcome of Petersberg Dialogue, the 12th edition. We have seen last week in virtual mode. Angela Merkel, who was in 1995 Environment Minister and presided over the first conference of the parties, COP1 in Berlin, and we have crafted together the Berlin Mandate. And then she initiated the Petersberg Climate Dialogue. And every year for last couple of years, we have seen that Petersberg Climate Dialogue has been phenomenal, especially galvanizing the effort of leadership, political leadership, because we negotiators negotiate technical issues, but at times political issues, it is beyond of our jurisdiction, and political masters should come in and try to hammer that, try to crack down the hard nerves. And the hard nerves somewhere cracked, especially US President Joe Biden's Climate Leaders Summit on Earth Day, April 22nd and 23rd this year. And also we welcome the return of the United States to Paris Agreement. And in his leaders climate summit, some of the leaders promised to cut back their emission in an ambitious way, but some are still shied away. So how best we can galvanize them? How best all the countries can raise their ambitions? Because we are still far short to reach the 1.5 degree temperature rise limit, that Paris Agreement vision. So how best we can also raise the ambition of climate finance, adaptation and mitigation finance, technology transfer, capacity building, and also cracking the hard nerves, especially Article 6 of the Paris Agreement, the rule book. We are yet to crack that. So these are the agenda items we have confronted in our way to Glasgow come November. So how best we can, especially the incoming COP presidency in UK, can raise that ambition. There are also fear that would the return of the United States would be short-lived one, because in the past we have seen United States withdrawn from from Kyoto Protocol in 1997. A landmark Kyoto Protocol was signed by Al Gore, but then it was not ratified. Rather, Bush Jr. Withdrawn from it. So this time also, John Kerry negotiated it, Barack Obama negotiated Paris Agreement, but then also Donald Trump withdrawn from it. So this time Joe Biden came in. His term is for 4 years. After 4 years, what will happen? So there are some fears. How best we can build trust in the multilateralism, in climate negotiation, climate fairness. So these are the Herculean tasks. We have to build trust. I would now like to request Halldor, who has been a seasoned negotiator and also United Nations Framework Convention Director for many years, who has seen lot of ups and downs, lot of kinky roads he had passed. So Halldor, over to you. What is your assessment? What is your reflection? What is your prudent judgment?
Thank you very much, Quamrul, and it's great to be with you and reflecting together on where we stand on this. And you have recalled the history, but there is one thing that I think is really important to understand now, that the economics have changed. And so yes, you have pointed to the lack of stability in the participation of the United States, but that has been more on the surface in terms of the political play in Washington. At the same time, the investments have been moving out of fossil fuels. The growth of investment in renewable energy is unstoppable, and this is why it's really important that there's political leadership in Washington, and I welcome it very much that we now have a clear political leadership. But what my point is that we are not going to go back on some of the fundamentals. In other words, investment in old energy technology is not attractive to investors, but we are not building the capacity on renewable energy fast enough. And that's why it's so important. What the United States is doing now is to mobilize private investment at large scale, because we know that the energy transition and the decarbonization is going to require a lot of capital, much beyond what governments will be able to do alone. So I think there are some really important kind of changes in the real economy that that should be a source of encouragement. But we are in a race against time, as we know. That's why this kind of very clear political leadership is essential. You mentioned the Petersberg Dialogue, which is an annual moment for political leadership to be refocused on the tasks ahead. And we are all now focused on Glasgow, which is the next conference of the parties. That conference is going to be much more about delivery and about coming forward with both clear vision for carbon net zero economy and a resilient economy, but also delivering a more ambitious shorter term contributions for 2030, the nationally determined contributions. So that's a very welcome difference, that we're not so much now dependent on outcomes in negotiations, but it's more the delivery on the ground. And so I have now left the international sphere, and I'm now working on turning the Paris Agreement and the promise of the Paris Agreement into reality at the national level. And this is where I think the action is moving now. And we know action speaks louder than words. And that's where I think the moment of truth will be. Where do you put your money? How do you work with developing countries, and kind of build that that future we want together?
Thank you, Halldor. You have back to Iceland and also leading the National Commission on Climate Change. So that is very important to marshal all your efforts to take action onto the ground, which we have been freezing for many months, many years. So thank you.
Maybe I could, if you allow me, maybe I could just make one more point on that. One of the critical things that needs to happen at the national level is that we need to realize that this is a whole of government effort. Yes, we need climate ministers or environment ministers to be in the lead on the specifics, but the ministries of finance, the economic ministries are really essential. And so one of the things that we have advised the government of Iceland, and we are very happy that they have heeded our advice, is that they need to change the way they deal with climate in the cabinet. And they have done so. And that's something that I think is critical, that we now realize that this is so much about what building the future we want. And that goes beyond the authority of environment ministers.
Thank you, Halldor. I think you can also learn something from Dr. Mashiur Rahman, our finance advisor to the Honorable Prime Minister, because in Bangladesh, we have done a lot, especially Bangladesh Climate Change Strategy and Action Plan, then also Climate Change Trust Fund, Resilience Fund, and also budget. In budget, we have a budget line. So that is say a great movement. I would now like to ask Zia. Can you hear me? Ziaul Haque. Very briefly.
Yeah. Yeah.
What is your thought,
Quamrul
reflection?
Bhai.
Yeah.
Thank you, Quamrul Bhai, and good morning, good afternoon, distinguished participants. I also see the respected Mashiur Rahman sir, the Honorable Advisor to the Prime Minister, here with us. At the same time, the Harold, he has been with us for long years, and Alan Miller and other colleagues. In fact, what I would like to start with what the Halldor has already pointed out on some specific issues. For instance, he has said that the global economy since 1992, when the convention was adopted, now it is almost 22 years, almost 21, 22 years. So the global economy has changed to a greater extent. So we have to acknowledge this fact. And when the 30 years, almost 30 years. So we have to consider the changes that happened in the global economy, the advancement, the technological advancement, and the economic prosperity across the countries, in developing countries and some countries that was not developed at the time when the convention was adopted in 1992. So it is a fact. And at the same time, Halldor also pointed out about the domestic issues, that we should consider the spirit of whole of government approach, whole of society approach. And many countries, including Bangladesh, has actually has taken initiative towards this end, the whole of government and whole of society approach, and it will be strengthened as we go along the process in the future. At the same time, since I have been in the process for quite some time, I have seen in the negotiations, particularly the country-driven, party-driven negotiations, that the fundamental thing is that we have to build the mutual trust and confidence among the parties, among the country parties. And in some cases, we achieve this mutual trust and confidence. In some cases, we failed to actually to achieve those kind of outcome that we were expecting. And in terms of Paris Agreement, due to the big political push, we achieved this mutual trust and confidence, so that the Paris Agreement was happened, and we agreed together by 195 parties that it is a universal document, and we have to carry forward this spirit and principle of Paris Agreement together in line with the common but differentiated responsibilities and respective capabilities, as well as in the light of different national circumstances. So this is the time that we agreed that we will take the burden, we'll share the burden in line with the common but differentiated responsibilities and respective capabilities. So we agreed in Paris that we'll do so, and at the same time, we have seen that after 2016, we have lost this kind of spirit that we had during Paris, and it was somewhat eroded in terms of mutual trust and confidence, particularly after withdrawal of the USA from the Paris. So, but even you can imagine that within 1 year, Paris Agreement came into force. This is unprecedented event that one UN international treaty has been come into force within 1 year, and it happened. But from 2017 and onward, this trust has been eroded to some extent, and that has been manifested in the outcome of the COP25. And I feel that over the next 6 months, this trust will be regained by the global leaders. And then we have got the political momentum after the Leaders Summit, as well as the Petersberg Dialogue. So we feel that we will regain this mutual trust and confidence. Again, we'll agree to share the burden together in terms of common but differentiated responsibilities and respective capabilities. Thank you.
Yeah. All hands should be put on the deck. Alan Miller. You have seen a lot of ups and downs. So now before us, the virtual subsidiary body meetings in June, from 31st of May to 17th of June, say 18 days, are prolonged subsidiary body meetings, because we also need to give our negotiators some time so that they can help crack down the issues, try to marshal their effort in terms of drawing convergences, drawing common grounds, common landing zones. So there are issues like Article 6 of the Convention, Article 6 of the Paris Agreement, the market and non-market mechanisms, the rule book, the loss and damage, the Santiago network, how to strengthen that. Or what about the, say, financing of loss and damage? What about the balancing of adaptation finance with mitigation? Yes, in Biden Leaders Summit, we have seen lot of commitments, even finance. But there was hardly any talk about adaptation in Biden summit. Adaptation was very low profile and only resilience was discussed, not adaptation per se. So what adaptation means, what adaptation goal we do require, because even if today we stop all the emission, then also we need to adapt for next 40 to 50 years because of temperature rise. That adverse effect we have to adapt. So these are the challenges the humankind, the mankind is facing. Alan, over to you.
You've given me a very difficult, almost impossible challenge to address. But first, just thank you, because it's always a great honor to be in touch with colleagues from Bangladesh, and knowing for how long your country has really been a leader in attempting to think about adaptation. And I still recall fondly my visits to Bangladesh for exactly that reason. I wanted to emphasize maybe just a couple things first, and then I'll come back specifically to your question. I don't know if you mentioned it or who did, but I have just published a book, so you'll excuse me if I want to just very briefly mention the focus of my book, which is with two very distinguished co-authors, Durward Zelke and Stephen Anderson, actually goes to the Montreal Protocol. And I think one of the, I hope Halldor will excuse me for saying, but in some respects, the Montreal Protocol has done more to address climate change than the UNFCCC. So as we know, the regulation of CFCs itself avoided as much warming as all CO2 emissions historically. CFCs, if we had not prevented their use, would literally have doubled the amount of concentration of greenhouse gas in the atmosphere. But in addition, the Kigali Amendment in 2016 has brought much more protection against warming so far than the Paris Agreement. And it really reflects the importance of addressing short-lived climate pollutants, particularly the HFCs, which are addressed by Kigali, methane, which was now being addressed more by the United States in a bipartisan political agreement, an action just taken by the US Environmental Protection Agency. But we need to do a lot more on short-lived climate pollutants, because as I think you would agree, reductions in CO2 over the next few decades, even if we do achieve net zero by, say, 2050, as many countries have proposed, it will not slow warming. This is a scientific fact. It's not being emphasized enough that in order to slow warming for the next few decades, we have to deal with short-lived climate pollutants. So that's my book. I just want to, if I can, just put that out there. And I do feel the summit which just occurred, for example, China has now agreed to ratify the Kigali Amendment, and Vladimir Putin announced that Russia supports a further methane agreement. So I think there is a lot happening that is at least giving some indication of action on those. Secondly, just on this issue of the unreliability of the United States and the problem of the 4-year variation that we have at risk, I do want to add to what Halldor said, that I think the economics are very much now very different on the mitigation side. I'll come back to the economics because I don't think we have the same momentum on adaptation as was implied by your question. But I would add that just in understanding the US situation, and mind you, we just saw that China is now 27% of global emissions, equal to all the developed nations combined. So just to put that into perspective, the US has now been reduced to 11% of total emissions. It's still important politically, but it's less and less important in terms of total emissions. The other feature of the United States, of course, is state and local governments are increasingly acting independently of the federal government. And some of them are the largest economies, including California and New York, who in combination amount to about 70% of US GDP. So the prospect, I think, given Halldor's point about the economics and the reality of state and local government, is that, frankly, I'm less worried about what will happen in a few years' time. I would be terrified if we had a re-election of President Trump, but I actually think on the climate front, we're increasingly moving in a good direction. To come back to your point about adaptation, I absolutely agree. I think it was very concerning not to see nearly the equivalent reference and commitment to action on adaptation, given that, as people in Bangladesh know so well, your contribution to mitigation and emissions is trivial, and your vulnerability is extraordinary. And that is true of something over 100 countries, which collectively emit maybe 3% of total emissions. All of sub-Saharan Africa, less than 3% of total emissions. And consequently, while I think the GCF commitment to 50-50 split between mitigation and adaptation was a very significant step, what hasn't been matched, to come back to some of what Halldor said, is we haven't figured out yet how to shift private investment much more effectively into resilience. And I think there is, I worked at the GF Secretariat for 6 years at a time when we did almost nothing on adaptation, really until the politics began to change in the approaching 2008, 2010. And we're still really way behind. And I think that's really a reflection in part of our international failure to really better define what is required of resilience to achieve resilience, and then to work out the policies and incentives that will begin to shift private investment in the way that Halldor described. So we're doing that with mitigation. We're seeing billions of dollars flowing into renewable energy, and not enough still, too much into fossil fuels still, but that shift seems to be inexorable. In contrast, there is just an extraordinary need to far more effectively define the effective measures for resilience and to create the policy environment that essentially tells the financial community through things like the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosure, you are throwing your money away if you put your money into high-risk, climate-vulnerable projects. And that appreciation, I think, is gradually happening. But again, to echo Halldor, time is running out. We are approaching tipping points that may be irreversible with the melting of the permafrost. We are seeing accelerating changes at the poles with the rate of melting. And science seems to have consistently underestimated the degree of risk. And there's a natural conservatism in the way scientists operate, not to overstate things. And I recall this from ozone depletion as well, going back, to the ozone hole in the 80s, when scientists really wanted to be certain that that ozone hole was due to CFCs before they would say so. And we still have built in, I think, to the IPCC. I was impressed by the 1.5 degree report in the degree to which it said we collectively have to be acting. We have to, but I guess just to close on your question, I think you have really hit something that really needs a great deal more emphasis. And if there is anything I hope can be brought to the fore from that series of political events, as you said, we have this busy calendar. I don't go to these meetings. I don't know about you. I don't go to these meetings anymore. I am very, Halldor said he's retired as of 2018. I am very happy. I went to 16 COPs. I went to the INCs before the COP.
Yeah. 91, 92 in
I went to Montreal protocol meetings, right?
Yeah.
Before. And I'm just as happy not to keep going to those meetings. I would say if there's one hope I have for this series of events through the rest of this year, it's that it will achieve this greater recognition about the importance of enhancing resilience, defining adaptation, and beginning to shift investment, not just public. There's of course, everybody's focused on the GCF, the GF, how much money they're getting. Is it enough? It's never going to be enough. It will never be enough. And we know that, those of us who've been in this system. But, I do see this extraordinary beginning of interest within the financial sector with green bonds, with climate bonds, we now have resilience bonds. And China is issuing these things, and the EU has been issuing these things, and the market demand for them seems to be there. So those are the things that give me some basis for optimism. But I just will close by saying, when Halldor starts to sound like Greta in talking about running out of time, that puts this into perspective. that we really do have this urgency, and I'm not sure the political system, with some exceptions, John Kerry is out there and he's attempting to give this message, and there are some others, but this sense of urgency to me is what's really the biggest worry.
Thank you very much, Alan, for your very prudent and thoughtful comments, observations. I would now like to request Dr. Mashiur Rahman, who is a finance guru in Bangladesh. He has served as Joint Secretary Budget in our Ministry of Finance. Then he was also Joint Secretary World Bank in our Economic Relations Division, and also Economic Relations Division Secretary. He was our National Board of Revenue Chairman, our Internal Resource Division Secretary. So lot of portfolios he had covered in his long bureaucratic career. And he was our labor secretary, he was our statistics secretary, so many hats he had to wear in those days in his civil service career. Then he joined politics, and he is now Honorable Prime Minister's economic advisor. So over to you, Moshi bhai. Your audio, unmute. Unmute.
Oh,
yeah. Okay. We're here.
A greeting to all the speakers, and I must say that I have to get acclimatized fully to climate change theme. The first time I was involved in it was when the government set up an endowment fund for climate change. I chaired that committee. But at that time, I did convey to the government that the endowment fund is not enough. We have to get more money into the climate change impact. The other time I was involved in it was when we were preparing the 5-year plan, the 5-year plan, which will come into force now. We did calculate the cost of the development investment. And it appeared that the infrastructure is the most costly thing that we have. And if there is sufficient investment in infrastructure, other investments pick up, and other investments at a low level of investment, you get the same output. So more efficient investment can happen if there is enough investment in infrastructure. What I feel is that there is enough scientific data which should cause a concern to all of us. There are some theoretical economic knowledge like Tobin tax, a global tax, and so on. But we have not yet come to grips with those concepts. And investment is still left to the private entrepreneurs. And they have their own considerations, they have their own problems, and so on. So there is a mismatch between the global public good and the individual level entrepreneurs' interest. And it's a complex issue how to match the two. Now, I guess the development goal or the growth goal, that has to be sustained. If a country doesn't have enough income, and if the government does not have enough revenue, then it is difficult to imagine how the government can sustain sufficient investment, how the country can sustain sufficient investment. Now, we are in a particularly difficult situation now. We'll go through it. We will overcome it. The prescription for, the sustainable development has included clauses focusing on sustainable resource use and so on. Now, in order to do that, and also we are now a middle-income country aspire to go on to the high middle-income level and on to the developed country level. As we do so, there are some pressure on the aid, concessional loan that we are getting. There are also conditions which qualify access to the market. And the new conditions which are coming now are more concerned about improvement of human rights, improvement of labor safety, and so on. They are important in their own right. There's no question about it. And I must say that the government has, we'll go through it, we will overcome, done a lot in order to implement the spirit of those conditions. Maybe not exactly the prescriptions which were received, which were given, but the spirit was there and implemented subject to the condition that we could not compromise with the development momentum. I said development because it is high growth plus other qualities of growth, like poverty reduction, inequality reduction, gender parity, and so on. So the 2 or 3 conditions which I believe the international community have to take into account is how to facilitate access of the developing countries' exports to the developed market. Second is the carbon emission has been emphasized very rightly, but we have also a methane emission issue that also need to be looked at. There was reference to renewable energy and solar energy. I hear from some energy experts that it requires vast area and which is not used for human purposes, like not setting up an industry or maybe not even human settlement. The other problem is we have set up a Solar and Renewable Energy Development Authority, but it's a small organization relative to the Power Development Board, the state corporation which is responsible for purchase and selling it or giving it to the transmission companies and so on. So SREDA, I guess, needs to be stronger in order to realize power which does not emit as much as it does. But the other thing is the taxation problem. We have one of the very low tax GDP ratio, and the tax problem has another aspect. The foreign investment is required, but foreign investment doesn't come unless some tax benefits are given. If the tax benefits are given, we get growth, we get perhaps employment also, because they will invest in technology. But the tax does not grow up correspondingly. There are some talks now, or this has been going on in the OECD framework, how to harmonize tax and how to discourage the investor from OECD countries to invest where they get good tax breaks. Now that needs to be neutralized in favor of the developing countries, at least for those who are entering in the new trade regime and has to have access, and that access can be facilitated along with growth of the economy and tax collection by neutralizing this effect on tax breaks. Now, one or 2 points about the techniques of economic planning. Jeffrey Sachs, who is a great promoter of Millennium Development, Sustainable Development, he indicates 3 areas of concern. One is clinical, which he borrows from psychiatry. That shows that makes it imperative that planning for a country must take into account fully the characteristics of the economy. So the economy all economy is not equally adaptive. The second is geography, which includes climate, which includes the population settlement, river flows, and so on. That needs a lot of international intervention. We have now the Transborder River Convention, to which many of the countries that we share rivers with have not signed up. And the last the most important for economics is what he says, that a macroeconomic stability has to be maintained. Now, maintaining stability now, which prescribes moderate or regulated deficit financing, that has become impossible not only for developing countries but also for the developed countries. And the injection of liquidity in the developed countries creates excess liquidity which flows into the reserve of these countries. So you have an imbalance across the countries and also in the countries across sectors. These are the international aspects of financing that should be addressed. Finally, more finance has to flow into the developing countries, and more of concessional aid has to flow. It cannot be left to private flows and private investment only. As of now, the global aid is 0.3% of the aggregate GDP of the developed countries. The target for, I think, how long? For about half a century at least, has been 0.7% of the aggregate GDP growth.
Never
We are
missed it.
far below that. There are some calculations that it need to go up to 0.7% or at least 0.6%. That is twice as much as it is now. There are countries which are contributing a lot. There are countries which have contributed more than 1% of the GDP, but the aggregate flow has not improved. It has remained stuck there. So that is also an area that the international community has to look at. So I would conclude that there is enough scientific knowledge, there is adequate economic analysis as to what needs to be done, but it's difficult to implement that. there is also some calculation showing how much money needs to flow, but we do not know exactly how to cause that to flow. These are the 3 or 4 issues that we need to address seriously. Thank you very much for inviting me to this occasion, which gives me an opportunity to brush up my rusted knowledge about climate change.
You have seen from the Halldor, we are going to meet virtually for 18 days the subsidiary body meetings, and also in between we have G7 meeting and G20 meeting. So what is your take, especially what is your advice for our SB meetings?
Well,
Are you asking? No, sorry.
if I could, I mean, it's really important that we stay focused on results, and that's why I would hope that the efficiency of international conversations is increased. And I share Alan's concern that that we sometimes invest more in meetings than the results. Of course, we need international or global governance, but it needs to be focused very much on delivery. And I fully agree that that needs to be equally on the adaptation side. Because the challenges around adaptation are actually in many ways more complex than it is on the mitigation side. At the same time, the sessions that are now going to be in Bonn, they need to pave the way for a success in Glasgow. And that's something that I think is critical, because this also comes back to this discussion we had earlier about trust and confidence. The general population, and I think the general citizens, are more concerned by the day about the risks around climate change, and they demand leadership from the leaders. And this is why I don't want to sound too dramatic here, but I think we are coming up to a moment of truth on some of these conversations. And this is why the urgency, the real world realities need to be very much in the mind of everyone that serves either as a delegate of their country to the more technical meetings that are going to be in June, but also the people that are mandated to go to the higher level. What I think also I wanted to underline as another function of the international cooperation, and that is to empower the wonderful people that are working on national implementation. And this is one of the things that when I was organizing these meetings, I felt a bit of, I was concerned that we were sucking the talent out of basically the front lines, which is at home. And this is why I think it's so important that we do not create a separate bubble that is isolated from the realities, and bring as much as possible the realities from the ground. But the realities of the ground are not just negative; they are also very encouraging, very positive. And I recall, for example, the effort that we made in the lead up to Paris to really demonstrate to the negotiators that they were not alone. The mayors wanted an outcome, the business wanted an outcome, the spiritual leaders wanted outcome, the youth wanted outcome. And this is why I think it's also so important that we constantly remind people of how both how precious time is, but also the benefits of basically accelerating the transition to net zero. And I know that net zero is for many feels to be far away. I live in a country that has set for itself to become carbon neutral by 2040, and that's only 20 years away. And that's something that I think it's also very important to be bold, to think, to basically have faith in the future. But I also fully share the concerns that has been raised about the challenges around dealing with impacts, because that's where the rubber hits the road in a way, because we basically have to deal with the impacts and as they are manifested. But we talked earlier about moving money, and in many ways, the greatest return you can get on an investment is to avoid damage, is to prevent losses. And that is something that, but it does require global solidarity. And if I could just end by just taking an example from the small island, well, it's not a small island, it's 100,000 square kilometers. But Icelanders agreed to put levy on all homes in Iceland to raise enough money to deal with the most vulnerable populations that were exposed to natural disasters from avalanches. And I've used this example very often when I was working at the international level. So we need to be able to expand solidarity from only being to the people that are belonging to the same nation. We need truly global solidarity. And if anything, the current pandemic has, if there was any doubt that we are interdependent, the virus has taught us that we are. And this is why and this is not just some nice talk for Sundays. It's really reality. And this is why, for example, in terms of impacts of climate change in Iceland, the greatest worry we have is how it will affect others, because we are dependent on others. So this is kind of my final thoughts on this. Thank you.
Thank you, Halldor, for your prudent comments. Even say, looking at our negotiators like Ziaul and others to try to concentrate on the grants issues and also look beyond. I would like to ask Ella, come to you, because the new inconvenient truth is that we are not looking at adaptation. We are not looking at resilience building. We are more concerned about creating jobs, as Joe put it. in his, say, $1 trillion infrastructure plan. Everything is on infrastructure and also creating jobs, not reaching adaptation goal at such. You know that in our INC days, 91, 92, we had a lot of debates. We tried to have a balance, even at that point of time, mitigation and adaptation. But say we are subsidizing every year $5 trillion for fossil fuels. But our carbon market, total carbon market, is not even $500 billion global. Though just last week it crossed €50 per unit of carbon price. In European countries, but it plummeted to almost several cents once upon a time, and that also jeopardized adaptation finance through Kyoto Protocol Adaptation Fund Board as a levy. Halldor, you remember that? Okay, so adaptation in the most vulnerable countries, where the casualty of that plummeting price of carbon. So how to meet that, say, mystery? Alan.
You ask very tough questions. So there is no simple answer. But I think Halldor already pointed to at least a partial answer, which is the increasing awareness of the people who have trillions of dollars, not just billions, but trillions of dollars. The sovereign wealth funds, the pension funds, and the insurance companies who are really becoming aware that investing in infrastructure, which is going underwater, figuratively and literally, is a very bad investment. And making the tools and analytical methods that will allow investors to understand those risks better has actually only been very recently. So Mark Carney gave his speech, The Tragedy of the Horizon, only in 2015. And the Bloomberg Commission, the task force under the Financial Stability Board, only issued its first report in 2017. So it's actually been, to me, encouraging that we have begun to see, even if there is this imbalance that you noted, continuing in fossil fuels, there is the beginning of a rectification, a long overdue rectification. And it's coming from insurance companies who are realizing they will lose their shirts if they continue to insure properties in coastal areas and have to pay damages, if they insure homes in wildfire areas, and etc. And I think I'm more optimistic, frankly, that the private sector funds will move and shift relatively fast than, frankly, that we're going to dramatically increase carbon taxes and public funds, because that problem has been there forever. And that 0.3% figure, as your advisor noted, has been a problem for decades. And so I think that is a real tough nut to crack in a place like the United States in some ways. So, but I do think we are beginning to connect resilience to jobs. Biden talked about how monitoring and fixing methane leaks will be a source of jobs. And I think there will be a need to make the case for the economic benefits, the financial benefits. And then the final comment is just that I do think institutions like the JEF and GCF and the World Bank and other MDBs are starting to focus more on how they can use guarantees and other financial instruments so that without a huge increase in public funding, which I just don't think is likely, they can far more effectively leverage private investment. And I think the combination of increasing awareness, the creation of the necessary analytical tools that we're seeing, and then the use of guarantees and other instruments can leverage that shift. So I think it's happening. I think it will continue, but it needs to happen faster. And that's where this issue that Halldor echoing Greta, if I can, Halldor, I'm gonna put you in together with Greta and just say that message of time and running out of time is, to me, is the thing that I worry about the most, and where I hope, just to conclude, that all these meetings, the Bonn meetings, the Glasgow meetings, can respond more effectively and efficiently to that sense of urgency.
Thank you for your very prudent comment. Dr. Mashiur Rahman, say a couple of years back, in our national budget, Finance Minister Mohit, he flagged the issue of carbon tax. But then it just eluded. So what is the prospect? Do you see any prospect in carbon tax? Or because in Article 6 conversation, in climate change parlance, climate change negotiation under Paris Agreement, we are now talking about carbon pricing, carbon tax, market mechanism, non-market mechanism. These are non-market mechanisms, of course. So how do you foresee, and what is your prudent advice for the negotiator? And your final comment. Dr. Mashiur Rahman. Mashiur, hi. Unmuted.
Is the question addressed to me?
Yeah. So what is your last comment?
That's a pretty
final word.
I mean, it is a complex issue. That's a complex issue. I'm not very sure if leaving it to the private financial flows can adequately address the issue. The private flows or the private investment would be concerned about climate change if there is a public authority sanction for contributing to climate change, climate deterioration, and so on, which would mean that the several national governments have to impose certain taxes or certain penal measures. If it is left to the developing countries, mainly or equally, there won't be enough money into that fund. So the developed countries perhaps have to consider that the levy should be proportionate to the GDP of the country plus the emission that they cause. But I mean, having said that, it is very difficult to a very complex governance issue. Can we have a global government which can impose taxation? As of now, no. And we cannot foresee the time when such an authority can be established at the global level. So what the global level can do, and I agree with the focus on creating awareness across the world, that is very important, and that sensitizes who has how much of obligation to finance and to facilitate implementation of the climate change antidote measures. I guess the first step has been taken and it has made considerable progress. Commendable progress in terms of generating scientific knowledge, generating the approaches which can be taken, but it has not yet generated the imperative that the government should act. I guess our next step should be how do we persuade the governments to act in terms of providing financing as much as they can and the sanction that they can apply to those investments and those operations which exacerbate climate deterioration and adverse climate impact. Those are the two steps that we need to take. But again, I will go back to the problem of financing and the issue of sustaining the growth and development momentum. If that is not sustained, for the countries which are still at a low level of consumption, at a low level of public service, at a low level of access to the benefits of a reasonably comfortable and reasonably quality life. Unless that is delivered, it is very difficult to persuade the people that they have to pay a cost for not addressing the problem of climate change. And I guess again, I would say that I would emphasize the point that the community needs to respond to that, engaged in creating that awareness. In Britain, a committee under Stern has been set up. I don't know about the rest of EU countries, but definitely EU is equally or more concerned about climate change. But since I don't know the European languages, I don't have access to that. In US, Nordhaus has been a champion of that, and he has Tobin taxes and so on. And I had a promotion of Millennium Development advice how we can go up.
Thank you.
Sorry, I guess I've been wrong. So these are the things I guess all of us have to get together and agree on the course of action. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Mashiur Rahman, for your wise words and advice. True that finance we need to unlock, but it's a huge task. Uh, when we are asking for trillions of dollars in the run-up to Copenhagen, then British Prime Minister at that point of time, say Gordon Brown, he came to us and he said that we can't promise you that much. If you agree, then we can have $100 billion per annum. And he also discussed it with President Obama of USA at that point of time. And they agreed and we also agreed. Then Green Climate Fund was created. But that $100 billion is yet to be, as Mushibai, you are asking that, 0.7% of GDP, that target never fulfilled, is reached only 0.3% of GDP. So like that, for Green Climate Fund, $100 billion not materialized in 2020. Now we have entered into 2021, almost halfway through, but nowhere near that target. Even Joe, he wanted his domestic agendas to resolve only 0.3% of GDP. So, like that, for Green Climate Fund, $100 billion not materialized in 2020. Now we have entered into 2021, almost halfway through, but nowhere near that target. Even Joe Biden didn't speak about that. He wanted his domestic agendas to resolve fast, concentrated more on domestic agendas than global agendas, multilateral. Yes, he said that multilateralism we believe in international cooperation, but that is for talk. But substantially, he acted on domestic front. Public finance, he mobilized for infrastructure, but he didn't mobilize funding for climate finance globally. So that is the tragedy. That is the tragedy of the commons. So how best we can move ahead, move a solidarity fund, create a solidarity fund like a Marshall Plan after World War II. Yes, if we can have Tobin tax, as our advisor was advising, we are talking about Tobin tax. Halldor, you remember, in Copenhagen, I made a couple of interventions on Tobin tax, but we couldn't. So that way we have to move. We have to have a robust system of climate finance for not only adaptation, loss and damage, capacity building, technology transfer, but also for mitigation. Because mitigation is the best adaptation, though adaptation has a limit. So we have to cross those. Yes, the political economy has changed abruptly from our INC days alone. You remember? So it has changed. So now we have to seize the opportunity. We have to face the new inconvenient truth and try to rise to the occasion in Glasgow. Probably we don't have much time. So we need to act right now, right here, right from today. Thank you very much. It was an extremely good conversation, though we lost couple of people, because of technology, they couldn't join. But anyway, show was on. Thank you very, very much, and hope to see you again in some other conversation in the run up to Glasgow. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Bye-bye.
Good luck.
Alan, thank you. Halldor, Mashiur bhai, thank you.
Okay.
Thank you.
আমি
Thank
অনেক
you.
কষ্ট করে join করছি।